It was a rainy night in New York, the kind where the streets glistened under dim streetlights and the air felt thick with secrets. Everyone knew Jay-Z was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the city. But there was always a murmur, an unspoken legend among those who worked in the shadows of the music industry. If you looked closely, you'd see it. He wasn't just the mogul. He wasn't just the rapper. Jay-Z was something else. And the rumors, they always said there was a price to be paid for the success, the power, the empire. The more you looked into it, the more you realized that some people had sold their souls for his rise. A young up-and-coming rapper, Danny, had heard the stories, but like so many before him, he was hungry, desperate. He wanted the fame, the fortune. He'd grown up listening to Jay-Z's music, studying the way he moved, the way he built his empire from nothing. And now, an opportunity had come knocking, an invitation to meet Jay-Z in person. The invitation came on a random Tuesday morning. A cryptic message slipped into his inbox. 9 p.m., 2nd Ave, room 45. No one will know what you're capable of. Danny didn't question it. He knew the deal. You want to make it in this game, you play by the rules, even if they don't make sense. That night, he arrived at an old building, barely lit, in the heart of Brooklyn. The air was damp. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, but it felt like he'd stepped into a different world. He rang the buzzer. The door opened silently. Inside, the hallway was long, the walls lined with portraits of people Danny didn't recognize. Some blurry, some obscured, some with eyes that followed him as he passed. It felt like something was breathing just behind him, but every time he turned, the hall was empty. He arrived at room 45. The door was already open. "Come in," Jay-Z's voice echoed from the darkness. Danny stepped inside, and as soon as he did, the door shut behind him with a quiet finality. He looked around. The room was stark. Just a chair and a table in the center, a single flickering light hanging overhead. But it wasn't empty. Sitting across from Jay-Z was a man whose face was obscured by shadows. Danny couldn't make out his features. The man's presence was overpowering yet unsettling, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Jay-Z didn't stand up, but his eyes gleamed in the dim light. "You want to be great, huh?" he asked, his tone casual but cold, as if testing Danny. His voice was smooth, like velvet wrapping around a blade. Danny nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I've been grinding for years. I know what it takes." Jay-Z leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically. "You think it's about talent or about money? Let me tell you something. This game, this empire, it's built on more than just that." The air in the room grew heavier, colder. It felt like something unseen was pressing in on Danny, like the walls were closing in. His breath came shallow, but he couldn't move. The man across from Jay-Z leaned forward slightly, and for a moment, Danny thought he saw eyes, dark, empty eyes, shining from the shadows. "You want to know what's really at stake?" Jay-Z continued, his voice now a low whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening. "The price of this power isn't money, Danny. It's your soul." Danny felt a chill that went deeper than the cold air. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "What do you mean?" Jay-Z smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "There's always a price. You want the fame, the money, the influence? It's all yours. But everything comes with a cost. You have to give something up, something real, something that'll never come back." A faint echo of laughter filled the room. The man in the shadows seemed to shift, but Danny couldn't look away from Jay-Z's eyes. They were cold, but there was something else, something ancient and knowing, like he had seen everything and was asking Danny if he was ready for it. "I'm ready," Danny managed to say, his voice shaking but determined. Jay's eyes flickered to the man in the shadows, who stood up slowly, almost imperceptibly. A chill ran down Danny's spine. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't just a business deal. This was something else, something he couldn't quite grasp. Jay-Z's voice dropped lower, and the air felt as though it had thickened, turned oppressive. "You'll be great. No one will stop you. But remember this moment, Danny, because you won't be the same after tonight." Suddenly, the man in the shadows reached forward, his hands moving with unnerving speed. The lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went black. The last thing Danny heard was Jay-Z's voice, distant but clear. "You wanted it all." When Danny awoke, he was alone in the room, his body cold, his heart pounding. His mind was foggy, as if he'd been pulled from a deep, dark place. He blinked, trying to gather his bearings, but something was different. The room, it was empty. The door was wide open now, and outside the hallway was completely silent. Danny stood up shakily and looked into the mirror hanging on the wall. He didn't recognize himself. His face, his eyes, were hollow, his expression empty, as though something vital had been drained from him. And then, from deep within his chest, a voice echoed in his mind. Jay's voice. "Remember, there's always a price." Danny stumbled back, horrified, as the sound of footsteps, his own footsteps, echoed behind him, growing louder. But no one was there. He was alone. But he was never alone again. In his reflection, he saw the shadow of Jay-Z standing behind him. But when he turned, there was no one there. The next day, Danny's name was everywhere. His music was charting, his face on every billboard. He was living the life he had dreamed of. But something was wrong. Every mirror, every reflective surface. He saw it, a shadow that never quite matched his movements, an emptiness in his eyes. And late at night, when the world was quiet, he could hear Jay's voice far off but clear, saying, "It's your soul, Danny, and it's mine now." In the end, Danny faded from view, just another success story who disappeared into the haze of the music industry. Some said he went mad. Others said he left the country, hiding in some far-off place. But if you ask around, if you listen closely, some people swear they still hear his voice, a whisper on the wind, in the back of their minds. And always, Jay-Z's voice, echoing in the distance. "You wanted it all. Now you belong to me." It was the night before the release of the Blueprint The 4. Jay-Z was on top of the world, but it wasn't just the album that had him excited. He had something much darker planned, a secret only a few knew about. Those closest to him, people who had seen the rise and fall of the empire, whispered about the price he had paid. But those who were ambitious, like Derek, a young, hungry producer, never believed the stories. He was too focused on his dreams. Derek had met Jay-Z at a private party in Manhattan a few months ago, just another networking event in the glittering world of hip-hop. The moment they spoke, Jay-Z had a look in his eyes, a hunger that felt almost predatory. It wasn't the kind of hunger that came from wanting more success. It was the kind that came from wanting everything. Jay-Z had noticed something in Derek, something special, and he'd invited him to the studio. Derek thought he'd just found the opportunity of a lifetime. When Derek entered the studio that night, the place felt different. It wasn't the usual industry buzz, the lights flashing in time with the beat. No, this studio had a coldness to it, a kind of sterile precision. There were no posters of Jay-Z's successes, no gold plaques, no glamour. It was a dark, dimly lit room, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. Derek could barely hear the low hum of music in the background, a deep bass that vibrated in his chest. "Yo, Derek, you ready?" Jay-Z's voice came from the far corner of the room, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows. "Yeah, I've been ready my whole life," Derek replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He had been trying to impress Jay-Z for so long, and now the man himself was in front of him. Jay-Z chuckled, a sound that didn't match his face, like something you might hear just before death in a horror film. "That's what they all say. But do you know what it really takes to get to the top?" Derek nodded, trying to play it cool. "Whatever it takes." Jay-Z stepped into the light, and for the first time Derek saw the man up close. His eyes were empty. There was something dark, unnatural about him, something that went beyond just ambition. It was as if he had seen and done things that no man should ever be capable of. And as Jay-Z reached into his pocket, Derek's heart began to race. "Listen," Jay-Z said, pulling out a small black object. It was an ancient-looking amulet, a symbol that Derek didn't recognize. "This is what separates the greats from the good. This right here is what makes legends eternal." Derek stared at it. "What is that?" Jay-Z smiled. "It's a piece of the past, something no one can get their hands on without paying the price. You want to be a part of history, you need to understand that you have to sacrifice for it." Real sacrifice. Derek felt a pit form in his stomach. But before he could say anything, Jay-Z's voice dropped to a low, eerie whisper. "If you want to truly make it in this game, you have to understand one thing. Power is a currency, fame is a currency, but your soul, that's the real price." Derek froze. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air in the room thickened, and Jay-Z's smile widened. "You see, Derek, we all make choices," Jay-Z continued, stepping closer to him. "The difference is, some of us make the right ones, and others, like you, will do whatever it takes to climb to the top." The studio went silent as Jay-Z approached Derek, his cold gaze never leaving him. There was a strange energy in the air now, as if the very space was alive with dark intentions. Jay-Z leaned in close, his breath cold on Derek's ear. "You want to be like me. You want to reach that level. Then you have to give up everything," Jay-Z whispered. "Everything. You see, I've done things to get where I am, things that, well, they aren't for the faint of heart." Suddenly, Derek felt dizzy. The room seemed to close in around him. He stumbled back, but Jay-Z grabbed his wrist, his grip unyielding, stronger than any human should have been. Jay-Z's face was inches from Derek's now, his eyes burning with a fiery intensity. "You don't get it yet, do you? It's not about talent. It's not about luck. It's about power. And power doesn't come without blood." Before Derek could react, Jay-Z pressed the amulet to his chest, and a sharp pain shot through him. It felt like a searing fire coursing through his veins. His vision blurred, and he could hear Jay-Z's voice again, echoing in his mind. "Now you're ready." The next thing Derek knew, he was on the floor of the studio, gasping for breath. He felt weak, disoriented, as if something inside of him had been ripped away. But it wasn't the pain that terrified him. It was the emptiness, a hollow feeling inside of him, as if his very soul had been drained. He looked up at Jay-Z, who was standing over him, his expression unreadable. "Get up," Jay-Z commanded, his voice like steel. Derek tried to rise, but his body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to him anymore. When he stood, his reflection in the glass window caught his eye. His face, his eyes, were different. Empty. It was as if he was looking at a stranger, someone who had been robbed of everything that made him human. Jay-Z's smile grew wider as he watched Derek's realization spread across his face. You'll be a star now. You'll have everything you ever wanted, fame, fortune, legacy, but you're never getting you back. Derek's breath caught in his throat. What did you do to me? Jay-Z laughed, a sound that chilled him to his core. I gave you the key to immortality, Derek. You'll never be forgotten. You'll never fade away. You'll be a part of something bigger than yourself. But at what cost? Your soul, your humanity, it's gone, and now you belong to me. Months passed, and Derek's career skyrocketed. He was everywhere. Radio, TV, clubs. His beats were the hottest in the industry. His face was on every billboard, but the emptiness inside of him only grew. He couldn't sleep without hearing Jay-Z's voice, a constant whisper in his ear. His dreams were filled with dark visions of what he had done to get here. One night, he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He staggered to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. His eyes were sunken. His skin was pale. He barely recognized the person staring back at him. The reflection was hollow, a shell. And then he heard it, a whisper from the shadows behind him. You wanted this, didn't you? You wanted to be great. Derek turned around, but no one was there. His breath caught in his throat as the voice echoed again, louder this time. You're mine now, Derek, and you always will be. In the end, Derek vanished. No one knew what happened to him. Some said he'd gone mad. Others claimed he had disappeared into the underworld of the industry, where deals darker than anyone could imagine were struck. But those who had worked with him whispered of his cold eyes, the emptiness behind his gaze. He was no longer human. He was something else. Something Jay-Z had created, someone who had paid the ultimate price for fame. And Jay-Z, he remained at the top, untouchable, his legacy unshakable. Those who sought to follow in his footsteps never saw the darkness that came with it, because the price for immortality was too high, and once you paid it, there was no turning back. I had always dreamed of it, the life, the one where you weren't just a name, you were a legacy, where doors opened because of who you knew, not just what you could do. I wasn't born into fame. I had to hustle, grind. But tonight, as I stood outside the gates of Blackstone Manor, everything felt different. The invitation had come through my agent's phone late last night. Jay-Z and Diddy, private party, midnight, don't be late. I knew what it meant. This was the kind of invite you didn't question, the kind that could change your career overnight. But I wasn't naive. I had heard the rumors, the whispers about these parties, the strange things that happened behind closed doors, the women who never left, the deals that were made in the shadows, the power that flowed through the rooms like a living thing. But I didn't care. This was my chance. I had worked too damn hard to get here. Tonight, I would make my mark. The mansion was massive, monstrous, really, hidden away at the edge of the hills, like a fortress that the world couldn't touch. The gates creaked open as I pulled up, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped out of the car. The air felt thick, the kind of thick that made everything feel heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I was led inside by a silent man in a black suit, his eyes never meeting mine as he guided me through endless hallways adorned with dark paintings. The kind of paintings that made you feel like the eyes were following you, like they knew secrets about you, about this place that you weren't meant to know. As we approached the ballroom, I could hear the muffled bass of the music vibrating through the floor. When the doors swung open, I almost didn't want to step in. The room was too vast, the atmosphere too charged. Inside, Jay-Z and Diddy stood near the center of the room, surrounded by an entourage of men and women who looked too perfect to be real. The women were beautiful, their skin glowing in the dim light, their bodies draped in expensive fabrics that barely covered them. But it wasn't just their beauty that caught my attention. It was their emptiness. They moved like automatons, slow, deliberate, their eyes vacant, their smiles plastic. They were beautiful, yes, but there was something hollow in their gazes, something dark that made my skin crawl. "Ah, you made it." Jay-Z's voice broke through my thoughts. He didn't smile as he spoke, but his eyes were piercing, like he was studying me, looking for something behind my eyes. Diddy flashed a grin that was too wide, too knowing. "We've been waiting for you. Tonight's gonna be special." I forced myself to smile, trying to push past the uneasy feeling that was creeping up my spine. I had come this far. I couldn't back out now. As I glanced around, I realized that there weren't many people here. A few celebrities, a couple of industry giants, mostly men. But it felt empty, like everyone was waiting for something, holding their breath. They weren't talking, they were just watching. The music shifted then, from the heavy bass I had heard earlier to something softer, more hypnotic. A low drone that seemed to crawl under my skin, making my pulse quicken. And then, the women started to move. They didn't dance, not in the way I expected. They moved in slow, measured steps, like they were part of some ancient ritual. Their eyes were locked on the men in the room, and as they circled the space, I could see the way the men's eyes followed them, hungry, almost desperate. But they weren't just looking at them. They were controlling them. The women had no say in it. They were like puppets, and the men, they were the ones pulling the strings. I didn't know what to do. I felt out of place, like I had stepped into a world I didn't belong to. The glances the women gave me felt like warnings. And then, one of the women came up to me. She was tall, with dark hair cascading down her back, her skin a deep shade of bronze. Her lips were painted a shade of red so dark it looked almost black. She didn't say anything, just moved closer, until we were standing face to face. Her gaze was piercing, as if she could see inside me, peeling away the layers I had carefully built over the years. "Don't get too comfortable," she whispered, her voice like velvet. "Not everyone makes it out. They don't want you to leave." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, her hips swaying with a mechanical precision that felt wrong, like she was being forced to move. I watched her disappear into the shadows, her presence lingering in the air long after she was gone. The night went on, and the party became stranger by the minute. The women started to change. One by one, they climbed onto the stage, stripping off the remnants of their clothes, their bodies becoming almost otherworldly as they moved in ways that didn't seem human. Some of them were writhing, others were swaying with the music, their eyes unfocused, their expressions vacant. The men, too, were changing. They were no longer the suave, polished figures they had appeared to be when I first entered. The more I watched, the more I realized they weren't in control of themselves either. They were obsessed, their eyes locked on the women as if they were the only thing keeping them from falling apart. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't even look at each other. They were consumed by whatever dark energy filled the room. I tried to push past the feeling that was clawing at my insides. "This is just a party," I told myself. "It's just about fun. A little wildness. It's no different than any other industry event." But then, Jay-Z appeared at my side. His presence was overwhelming, like he was pulling the air out of the room just by standing next to me. His eyes were cold, unreadable. He didn't touch me, but it felt like he was. "You want to make it in this world, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "You want the power, the fame, the legacy. You want to be someone." I nodded, unable to say anything. The room seemed to be spinning around me now, and I felt a deep, gnawing hunger that wasn't mine. "You think it's all about talent?" Diddy's voice came from behind me. I hadn't even seen him move. But talent doesn't get you to the top. Power does, control, and you have to decide right now if you're willing to give up everything to get it. If you want it, you can have it. All of it. I turned, my heart racing. They were both looking at me, their eyes intense, piercing, and the women, those hollow, soulless women, were watching too, their eyes fixed on me like I was the prey. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't a party. It was a test, a ritual, a dark, twisted game that I had been invited into, whether I was ready or not. The women weren't just entertainers. They were vessels. Their bodies, their souls, had been traded for power, for influence. They were nothing more than pawns in a game that had been played long before I got here. The glass of champagne in my hand suddenly felt heavier. The music pulsed louder, and I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, as if they were waiting for me to make my choice. I could hear Diddy's voice in my ear, but his words felt distant now, like they were coming from somewhere far away. "You have to make the choice, sweetheart. The price for power is everything." I looked around, at the women, at the men, at the empty smiles, the vacant eyes, and I knew deep down what they were offering, what they had all given to be where they were. And then I felt it. Something inside me snapped. The need for success, for everything I'd ever dreamed of, was too strong. The fear. It didn't matter anymore. I stepped forward, toward Jay-Z, toward Diddy, toward the future I'd been desperate for. But as I did, I felt it. The darkness that had been lurking in the corners of the room surge forward. It wrapped itself around me, pulling me in, making me feel light-headed. The faces of the women blurred in front of me, their expressions twisting into something darker. The price had been set. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. I had never imagined it would go like this. The kind of party Jay-Z and Diddy throw is a rumor among rumors, whispers in the dark corners of the music world, warnings in hushed voices at industry mixers. You hear the stories, the ones about the power, the decadence, the sacrifices. But when I got the invitation, I couldn't say no. It was a simple text. Midnight. Blackstone Mansion. Dress appropriately. Don't ask questions. That was it. No signature, no name. But I knew who it was from. Everyone knew. Jay-Z and Diddy didn't need to sign their names on anything. Their presence alone was enough to send the world into a frenzy. I'd worked for years, clawing my way through the music scene. I had slept on couches, gone through endless auditions, hustled for every gig. Tonight, I was supposed to be at the top. This party was my golden ticket. But the closer I got to Blackstone Mansion, the more that feeling of unease grew. The mansion was hidden away in the hills, tucked in the shadows of towering trees. As I approached the gates, I saw nothing but darkness, broken only by the flickering light from the mansion in the distance. The gates opened automatically, a low creak echoing in the air. My heels clicked sharply against the stone driveway, and I could feel the weight of the night press down on me as I made my way toward the door. The man who greeted me at the entrance said nothing, his eyes cold, his suit immaculate. He simply motioned for me to follow him through the halls of the mansion, which seemed to stretch on forever. The paintings on the walls were dark, their colors deep and unsettling, portraits of people with hollow eyes that seemed to watch me as I walked by. When I finally entered the ballroom, the first thing I noticed was the smell, a mix of expensive cologne, smoke, and something else, something metallic that I couldn't quite place. The room was enormous but eerily empty. The guests were scattered in groups, but they weren't talking. They were just standing there, eyes fixed ahead, as if in some kind of trance. I couldn't tell if they were all staring at me or just lost in their own world. Jay-Z and Diddy stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a group of models and industry elites. They didn't smile, didn't greet me as I walked in, but their eyes found mine immediately. I froze for a moment, my heart racing. Something about the look in their eyes was off. It wasn't just the intensity of their gaze, but the way they looked through me, like I wasn't even there. "Welcome." Jay-Z's voice cut through the silence, smooth and cold, like velvet dipped in ice. "You've made it." Diddy's grin was sharp, predatory. This is where the real game happens, not just in the boardroom, but right here. They didn't need to say much more. The way they spoke, the way they looked at me, it was as if they were sizing me up, deciding what part of me they could take for themselves. Something in the air felt off, thick with energy. It was like a current that ran through the room, making everything feel alive, like the walls were pulsing. I was about to say something, but then I noticed the women. They were standing at the edges of the room, draped in glittering lingerie, their skin glistening under the low lights. They weren't dancing. They weren't chatting. They were standing still. Their bodies were perfect, sculpted and flawless, the kind of women you'd see on magazine covers. But it wasn't their beauty that made me uncomfortable. It was the blankness in their eyes, the way they didn't move unless told to, like they were frozen in time. Something twisted in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. These were the women who had made it. They were at the top, living a life most would kill for. I wasn't here to judge. I was here to play the game. I tried to blend in, but the unease in my chest wouldn't let me. The music shifted. It wasn't the upbeat hip-hop or house beats I was used to. It was something darker, slower, a low hum that made the air vibrate. The women began to move, slowly, mechanically. They started undressing, peeling off their clothes one layer at a time. Their movements were like a dance, but it wasn't sensual or inviting. It was calculated, controlled. They were showing off, yes, but it felt like they weren't just doing it for attention. It was like they were performing, but for who? For what? Suddenly, a woman, tall and impossibly beautiful, stepped forward from the group. She was flawless, but her face was hollow, empty. She moved toward me without saying a word, and I felt myself involuntarily take a step back. The air around her felt colder, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. Her eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't look away. It was as if she could see into me. "You've been chosen," she whispered, her voice strangely hollow, like she wasn't entirely there. "This is the moment. The question is, will you pay the price?" Before I could react, the woman turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows with the others. My head spun. What did she mean? Chosen for what? To do what? But my confusion didn't have time to settle before Diddy appeared at my side, his hand brushing against my arm in a way that made my skin crawl. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, his voice low and full of something darker than I'd ever heard in the music world. He led me to the center of the room where Jay-Z was waiting, flanked by the women who had now surrounded him. I tried to speak, to ask what the hell was going on, but before I could, Jay-Z held up a hand. "We don't need words," he said smoothly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Not tonight. You're about to learn something much more valuable than any deal you could sign, any song you could write." Diddy smiled, a chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tonight, we give you a gift, sweetheart. But like all gifts, it comes with a price. The room seemed to pulse with the beat of the music, but it wasn't just sound anymore. It felt like the mansion itself was breathing, like it was alive, and it wanted something. The women, the men, all of them were looking at me now, eyes locked, expectant. A woman stepped forward, moving in sync with the music. She was tall, with dark hair and skin that shimmered in the dim light. She was completely naked now, her body painted in gold. She moved toward me slowly, hypnotically, and I felt something twist in my chest. This wasn't a dance. This wasn't entertainment. This was something far darker. She placed her hands on my shoulders and whispered in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. "You want the power, don't you? You want the success, the fame? But it costs. It costs more than you're prepared for." I felt my pulse race. What is happening? The woman's hands slid down my arms, her touch freezing, as if she were trying to steal something from me. My body felt heavy, my legs unsteady. The room was spinning. Jay-Z and Diddy watched, their smiles widening as the woman moved behind me, her breath warm against my neck. "You've been here before, you know," she whispered. "You just don't remember." Suddenly I understood. This wasn't just a party. It was a test, a ritual, and everyone here had already paid their price to get to the top. The women, the ones who stood still, the ones who were broken, had all given up pieces of themselves to be part of this world, and I was being asked to do the same. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but my body wouldn't move. The weight of their gazes kept me anchored, and I could feel the pull of something dark, something ancient, taking root inside me. I looked at Jay-Z and Diddy, their eyes glinting in the low light, and I realized that they were no longer just men. They were forces, like gods, and everyone here was a sacrifice in their game. The women, the guests, the men, all of them were trapped in this cycle of power and control. The question was simple. Would I take the step into this world, with all its darkness? Would I sell my soul for the success that could be mine? The woman's voice echoed in my head. "You can have it all, but it will cost you everything." And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I had just gotten my first big break, singing backup for a rising star, a chance to finally get my name out there. But the truth was, I was still struggling, still unknown, a far cry from the megastars whose names you see plastered across billboards and magazine covers. But one night, everything changed. It was an ordinary Wednesday when I got a text, a message that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "You're invited. Midnight. Blackstone Mansion. Don't ask questions. Come prepared." No name, no signature, but I knew. Jay-Z, Diddy. Everyone knew that their private parties were legendary, the stuff of whispers in the music world, wild rumors, half-told stories, bizarre rituals, strange symbols, powerful people coming together for a night that was both terrifying and intoxicating. I didn't know whether to be excited or terrified. But what I did know was that I wasn't going to let this slip away. This was a chance to make it, to rub elbows with the biggest players in the industry. This was a chance to make myself unforgettable. The gates opened without a word. I didn't even knock, just stepped right in, as if the place were waiting for me. The driveway stretched on forever, lined with trees whose branches twisted into unnatural shapes in the moonlight. The Blackstone Mansion loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture both stunning and oppressive. I had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer weight of the place. The windows were dark, and a strange chill filled the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A man in a black suit met me at the door, his face expressionless as he led me through the marble halls. The portraits on the walls weren't your usual aristocratic fare. They were strange, unsettling images, eyes that didn't quite look human, figures posed in unnatural, almost contorted ways. It felt like the house was watching me. I followed him through dark corridors, unsure of where I was being led. The sound of muffled voices and music grew louder, but it didn't sound like the usual hip-hop beats or rap anthems you'd expect from a Jay-Z party. It was something darker, an eerie, pulsating rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the air. And then, we were there. The ballroom stretched out before me like something out of a nightmare, vast and empty, except for the figures gathered at the far end of the room. They stood there in clusters, silent, unmoving, their eyes fixed forward, as if they were part of some trance. The air was thick with tension, and the heavy scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something metallic. I tried to look casual, tried to shake off the dread crawling up my spine, but the moment I stepped into the room, something felt wrong. There, standing at the center of it all, were Jay-Z and Diddy. They looked exactly as I'd imagined them, larger than life, dressed in sharp suits, exuding power. But there was something about the way they looked at me, something cold, calculating. "You made it," Jay-Z said, his voice smooth, like velvet wrapped in ice. "We've been watching you." Diddy stepped forward, a knowing smile on his face. "You're not like the others. I can tell. You've got potential." I nodded, trying to act like this was just another party, trying to ignore the feeling of being observed. The people around me seemed different. They weren't talking, weren't laughing. They were just standing there, their eyes locked on something in the distance, lost in some kind of trance. Then I saw the women. They were standing at the edge of the room, draped in the finest lingerie, their bodies glowing under the dim lights. At first, I thought they were part of the usual showgirls or models you see at these types of events. But then I noticed something strange. They weren't moving. They were perfectly still, their faces blank, their eyes lifeless. They looked almost dead. I glanced around, and I realized that none of the other guests were really interacting with them. They just stood there, frozen in place like statues waiting for something. The tension in the room was palpable, and I felt my pulse quicken as a sinking feeling settled in my chest. I turned back to Jay-Z, who was watching me closely. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out too sharp, too nervous. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's simple. You want to make it in this world. You've got to understand that nothing is ever as it seems. Everything comes with a price." Diddy's voice cut in smoothly. "And tonight, you're going to see what that price really looks like." Before I could respond, a woman in gold-dusted lingerie stepped toward me. She was tall, her skin glowing as if she were bathed in light. Her eyes met mine, and I froze. There was something wrong with her, something hollow, like there was no soul behind her eyes. "Come," she said in a low, cold voice. "You'll see." The ritual. The woman led me to the center of the room where Jay-Z and Diddy stood with a small group of other celebrities. The air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't place, something dark and ancient. I could feel my skin prickle, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if I was standing at the edge of something much bigger, something much more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The woman stepped aside, and I was left standing alone in front of the men. Jay-Z smiled at me, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of someone who knew they had power over you. "Look around," Jay-Z said softly, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "This is where it happens. This is where you learn what the world really wants from you, what the industry really wants." Diddy joined in, his grin widening. "It's not about talent. It's not about being good enough. It's about control, power, and if you want to take it, you have to understand the cost." I looked around the room, my eyes falling on the women who were now slowly beginning to undress, shedding their glittering clothes in a slow, methodical way. But it wasn't sexy. It wasn't playful. It was cold, detached. One by one, they stripped down to nothing, their bodies bare and exposed. But their eyes, those lifeless, vacant eyes, never left me. They were watching me, waiting. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a party. This wasn't just a celebration of success. This was a test to see how far I was willing to go, to see if I could pay the price. The woman in gold reappeared, her hands cold against my shoulders. She leaned in close, her breath a whisper against my ear. "You want it. I can see it in your eyes. You want the fame, the power, the recognition, but you have to give something to take it. What will you give?" I could feel the pull, like an invisible force drawing me deeper into the center of the room. Jay-Z's eyes were locked on me, his gaze intense, unreadable. I looked at Diddy, whose grin had faded into something darker. "It's time," he said simply, his voice low and threatening. The women were still there, their eyes never leaving me. They were waiting. I was waiting. I knew what they were asking. The question wasn't whether I was ready for success. The question was, what would I be willing to sacrifice to get it? The woman in gold stood next to me now, her face inches from mine. "Do you want it?" she whispered, her voice thick with a cold certainty. "Do you want to become it?" The music swelled, and the room seemed to shift. Everything was closing in on me, the shadows, the eyes, the weight of their expectations. I knew the answer before the words left my mouth. The next morning I woke up alone in my apartment, drenched in sweat. My head ached, my body felt wrong, as though I had been somewhere else doing things I couldn't remember. The world outside was just as I had left it. Nothing had changed, but something had shifted inside me. I stared at my phone, the screen flickering as it showed me a text message. "Welcome to the game." It was unsigned, but I knew exactly who it was from, and I knew deep down that there was no turning back now. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. I had been working in the music scene for years, climbing the ranks, making my name as a backup singer and a writer, but still waiting for my big break. When I got the text, I didn't think twice. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the message didn't leave room for doubt. "Jay-Z's in Miami. Big party. Come through. Midnight." There was no signature, no hello, just that one sentence. I stared at the words for a long moment. My mind raced. Jay-Z? In Miami? I'd heard rumors about his infamous parties, wild, secretive affairs where the city's elite gathered to indulge in every dark craving imaginable. The kind of party where you had to earn an invitation and where your life could change in a single night. I wasn't sure if I was ready for something like that. But who was I kidding? This was it. The chance to step into that world, the world where dreams were made, or broken. I texted back, "I'm coming." The drive to Miami. I could barely keep my hands steady as I gripped the steering wheel on the way to the venue. I had never felt more alive and more afraid at the same time. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Miami at night was a different world. The neon lights from the clubs and bars cast strange shadows on the streets, and the air was thick with the scent of salt water and possibility. As I neared the address, my heart started to pound harder in my chest. I parked in front of a sleek, nondescript building. No signs, no markings. It was just another block of luxury condos, with windows lit up in all the right places. But I knew. This was the place. A man in a black suit greeted me as I got out of my car, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask for ID or anything. He just nodded and waved me through a side door. I followed him through a dim hallway, and before I knew it, I was stepping into the heart of the party. The moment I walked in, I felt like I had crossed into a parallel universe. The club-like atmosphere was darker, slicker, more intense than anything I had ever experienced. The music was booming, deep and heavy, the bass vibrating through my chest, making it hard to think straight. The room was filled with the kind of people I had seen in magazines and on Instagram. The rich, the famous, the ones who didn't need to care about consequences. But it wasn't just the music, the lights, or the expensive champagne that caught my attention. It was the vibe. The air was charged with something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. People were standing around, drinks in hand, their eyes too focused, their movements too smooth. They weren't just partying, they were performing. Every smile, every laugh, every word was calculated, like everyone here was playing a role. Then, I saw them. Jay-Z was standing near the center of the room, tall and imposing, dressed in a sleek black suit. His face was unreadable, his eyes scanning the crowd, picking people out with the kind of effortless charisma that made you feel like you were the only one in the room. Beside him was Diddy, always the life of the party. But tonight, there was something colder in his eyes, something darker. The crowd parted as he moved, like they were all afraid to get too close. They weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. The women in the room were equally striking, tall, flawless, dressed in the finest designer outfits. But there was something off about them. Their smiles were too perfect, their eyes too cold. They seemed more like decorations than people. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room by the grand staircase, there was a group of people gathered. It wasn't the usual mingling or casual conversation. No, these people were standing too still, their faces expressionless, staring at the floor as if waiting for something or someone. A woman in a gold dress caught my eye. Her expression was cold, calculating. She made her way toward me, moving through the crowd like she was gliding across the floor. "You're new here," she said, her voice low, almost like a warning. "It's your first time at one of his parties." I nodded, my throat dry. I wanted to ask questions, but I knew better than to probe too much. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not like the others, is it?" she whispered. "People come for different reasons. Some come for the fame, the connections. Some come for the pleasure." She paused, looking around the room, "and some come for the price." I felt my heart skip a beat. "The price?" She didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward the center of the room where Jay-Z and Diddy were now standing, surrounded by a few other high-profile figures. There was a palpable tension in the air, something crackling, like the moment before a storm. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the crowd. I was left standing there, completely lost, trying to make sense of what was happening. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, and this time it wasn't just the music or the lighting that changed. It was the mood. A strange silence seemed to fall over the crowd, like everyone was holding their breath. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I realized with a sudden jolt that something was happening. I turned back to Jay-Z and Diddy, who had begun to move through the crowd, their eyes now more focused, their expressions unreadable. They were pulling people into smaller groups, talking to them with a quiet intensity. Then, one by one, women began to step forward, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused, like they were in some kind of trance. They were stripped of their clothes, of their identities. Each woman was led to a large, circular platform in the center of the room, where they stood, swaying as if in a hypnotic daze. My stomach churned as I watched. This wasn't a party. It was some kind of ritual, a dark, twisted game. The guests weren't here to have fun. They were here to consume, to take what they wanted without question, without remorse. I turned to leave, but something held me in place, something deep in my gut, telling me I had to see it. I saw Jay-Z approach the woman in the gold dress, his eyes dark with intent. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands. Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, waiting. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he kissed her. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't loving. It was cold, as if he were marking her as his possession. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a party. This wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction. I turned away, feeling sick to my stomach. This was not what I had imagined. This wasn't the kind of party I had dreamed about when I was struggling, writing songs in my tiny apartment. This was a world where power, lust, and control ruled. It was a world that didn't care about talent, didn't care about you as a person. You were either consumed or discarded. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I whipped around. It was the woman in the gold dress. "Don't try to leave," she said softly, her voice suddenly calm, almost reassuring. "You're here now. You belong to this world now." The words echoed in my mind over and over. You belong to this world now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I knew, deep down, that it was too late. This world had already marked me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of sound, light, and faces that seemed to shift, merge, and disappear. I tried to make my way out, but the walls seemed to close in around me, the hallways stretching endlessly before me. The door that had once been open was now locked, and the man who had greeted me at the entrance was nowhere to be found. I realized then that there was no escape. Not tonight. Not ever. The next morning I woke up in my hotel room, drenched in sweat, my mind racing. I could still hear the music, still feel the weight of the eyes on me, still taste the bitterness of the drink I had been handed. But everything had changed. The world felt different now, darker, colder. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that mansion hours ago. I picked up my phone to check the time and saw a message that made my stomach drop. "Welcome to the real game." It was unsigned, but I knew who it was from, and I knew then that there was no turning back.